I am Miss Marple, and this village is never as quiet as it appears. Welcome to my new case.
The fog descended upon Little Wickham like a grey shroud, muffling the familiar sounds of the December evening and transforming the village into something altogether more mysterious. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolly scarf as she made her way along the lamp-lit path to the parish hall, where the Winter Comfort's tea was already well underway. The annual gathering had become something of a tradition, bringing together the village's most prominent residents for an evening of charitable fundraising and, inevitably, the sort of gentle gossip that made rural life so endlessly fascinating to observe. Inside the warmth of the hall, the usual cast of characters had assembled around tables laden with homemade scones and carefully arranged chrysanthemums. Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife, was fussing over the tea urns with her characteristic nervous energy, while Dr. Haydock stood near the fireplace discussing the unseasonably thick fog with anyone who would listen. The evening's guest of honour, Mr. Reginald Fortescue, Member of Parliament for the constituency, had arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, his expensive overcoat still damp from the mist and his political smile firmly in place. Miss Marple settled herself at a small table near the window, her knitting bag at her feet and her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. She had always found these village gatherings to be rather like watching a well-rehearsed play, with each participant knowing their role perfectly. Mr. Fortescue was holding court near the platform, discussing his recent parliamentary work with the sort of practiced enthusiasm that suggested he had delivered the same speech many times before. His secretary, a sharp-faced young woman named Miss Caldwell, hovered nearby with a leather portfolio, occasionally checking her watch with barely concealed impatience. "Such a distinguished gentleman," murmured Mrs. Eastham, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a cup of tea that rattled slightly against its saucer. "Though I must say, there have been some rather unpleasant rumors about his business dealings lately. Nothing proven, of course, but you know how people talk." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noting how Mrs. Eastham's eyes never quite met hers as she spoke, and how her fingers worried at the handle of her teacup in a way that suggested genuine anxiety rather than mere village curiosity. The fog pressed against the hall's windows like a living thing, and several guests had already commented on how unusually thick it had become. Young Mr. Finch, who worked as a clerk in the village post office, mentioned that he had nearly lost his way walking the mere 100 yards from his cottage to the hall. "Can't see your hand in front of your face out there," he declared with a sort of dramatic emphasis that made Miss Marple suspect he rather enjoyed being the bearer of dramatic news. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple observed the subtle undercurrents that flowed beneath the polite conversation. She noticed how Mr. Fortescue's jovial manner seemed to falter slightly whenever anyone mentioned the proposed development of the village common, and how Miss Caldwell's attention kept drifting toward the door as if she were expecting someone. There was something in the air beyond the fog, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with the complex web of relationships and resentments that existed in any small community. At 9:30, Mr. Fortescue announced his intention to walk back to his lodgings at the King's Head, despite several offers of a ride through the fog. "A bit of fresh air will do me good," he declared, though Miss Marple noticed that his smile seemed forced and his eyes held a distracted quality that suggested his mind was occupied with matters far removed from village tea parties. Miss Caldwell gathered her things with efficient movements, mentioning that she would walk with him as far as the post office before turning toward her own cottage. The fog swallowed them both within moments of their departure, and the remaining guests began to disperse with the sort of reluctant haste that thick weather inspires. Miss Marple was among the last to leave, taking her time to help Mrs. Pemberton clear away the teacups and fold the tablecloths. As she finally stepped out into the night, she found herself thinking about the small details that had caught her attention throughout the evening. The way Mr. Fortescue had gripped his walking stick a little too tightly, the nervous glances Miss Caldwell had cast toward the windows, and the general sense that beneath the village's peaceful exterior, something was very much amiss. The fog embraced her like a cold, damp blanket as she made her careful way home, her footsteps echoing strangely in the muffled silence. She could not have known, as she navigated the familiar path by instinct and memory, that by morning the fog would lift to reveal a tragedy that would shake Little Wickham to its very foundations, and that her quiet observations of the evening would prove far more significant than anyone could have imagined. The fog lifted from Little Wickham with the grudging reluctance of a curtain being drawn back on an unwelcome scene. By 7:30, the thick grey shroud that had enveloped the village the previous evening had thinned to wisps, revealing the familiar outlines of cottages and hedgerows glistening with morning dew. The transformation was almost magical, as if the village were slowly awakening from an enchanted sleep, except that what the clearing mist revealed would shatter the peaceful morning routine that the residents of Little Wickham had come to expect. Young Timothy Fletcher, making his early morning deliveries for the baker, was the first to stumble upon the tragedy. He had been whistling a cheerful tune as he navigated the narrow path that led from the village centre to the King's Head, his basket of fresh bread balanced carefully on his arm. The fog still clung to the lower areas, and he was picking his way cautiously when his foot caught against something solid. Looking down, he found himself staring at the motionless form of Mr. Reginald Fortescue, lying crumpled beside the low stone wall that bordered the inn's back garden. The Member of Parliament lay on his side, his expensive overcoat twisted around him and his silver-headed walking stick resting several feet away in a patch of muddy grass. There was something unnaturally still about the scene, something that made Timothy's cheerful whistle die in his throat. The young man stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him before he dropped his basket and ran toward the village centre, shouting for help with a voice that cracked with shock and disbelief. Within minutes, the news had spread through Little Wickham with the speed that only truly shocking events can achieve in a small community. Mrs. Pemberton arrived at the scene still wearing her dressing gown, her face pale with distress. Dr. Haydock appeared shortly after, his medical bag in hand, and his expression grave as he knelt beside the still figure. The village constable, Sergeant Williams, did his best to maintain order, though his usual authority seemed somewhat diminished by the magnitude of what had occurred. Miss Marple, who had been tending to her morning correspondence, heard the commotion and made her way quietly to the scene. She positioned herself at the edge of the growing crowd, her presence so unobtrusive that she might have been part of the landscape itself. From this vantage point, she observed not only the tragic scene but the reactions of her fellow villagers, noting with her characteristic attention to detail how each person's behavior revealed something of their inner nature. Dr. Haydock's examination was thorough but brief. When he rose from beside the body, his face was troubled. "I'm afraid Mr. Fortescue is quite dead," he announced to the assembled group. "There appears to be a significant head injury, though whether from a fall or—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the morning air like the last wisps of fog. Inspector Slack arrived from the county police station within the hour, his manner brisk and his notebook already in hand. After a cursory examination of the scene, he pronounced his verdict with the confidence of a man accustomed to dealing with such matters. "Clear case of accidental death," he declared. "The fog was thick as soup last night, and these old paths can be treacherous. Gentleman must have lost his way, stumbled and struck his head on the stone wall. Tragic, but these things happen more often than you'd think." Miss Marple found herself studying the scene with quiet intensity. Something about the positioning of the body struck her as curious, though she could not immediately articulate what troubled her. The walking stick's placement seemed oddly deliberate, and Mr. Fortescue's clothing, while disheveled, showed none of the mud and debris one might expect from someone who had stumbled blindly through fog-shrouded lanes. The arrival of Miss Caldwell added another layer of complexity to the morning's events. The secretary appeared genuinely distraught, her face pale and her hands trembling as she answered Inspector Slack's questions. She had left Mr. Fortescue at the corner near the post office, she explained, and had assumed he would continue directly to the King's Head. He seemed perfectly well, she insisted, though Miss Marple noticed how her eyes avoided looking directly at the inspector as she spoke. As the official investigation began in earnest, the villagers gradually dispersed, carrying with them the seeds of speculation and theory that would soon bloom into the sort of gossip that made rural communities both fascinating and dangerous. Miss Marple remained longer than most, her pale blue eyes taking in details that others had overlooked, her mind already beginning to weave together the threads of observation that would, in time, reveal the truth behind the tragedy that had befallen Little Wickham. The morning's tragedy settled over Little Wickham like sediment in still water, each conversation adding another layer of speculation to the growing mystery. By the time Miss Marple had returned from her cottage with a more substantial coat, the village had already begun its peculiar process of transforming shock into theory, fear into gossip, and uncertainty into the kind of determined certainty that often proves most dangerous to the truth. At Polly's tea shop, Mrs. Eastham held court with the authority of someone who had appointed herself chief interpreter of the morning's events. "I always said there was something not quite right about that man," she declared, her teacup rattling against its saucer with the emphasis of her words. "Politicians make enemies wherever they go, and Mr. Fortescue had been asking rather pointed questions about the parish accounts lately. Poor Mrs. Armitage looked positively ill when he cornered her at the tea yesterday evening." This detail caught Miss Marple's attention as she settled quietly at a nearby table, her presence so unobtrusive that the conversation continued without pause. Mrs. Armitage, the church treasurer, had indeed appeared distressed during her brief conversation with the Member of Parliament, though Miss Marple had attributed it to the woman's naturally nervous disposition. Now, however, she found herself reconsidering that interaction with fresh interest. Young Mr. Finch, still pale from his morning discovery, offered his own perspective with the earnestness of someone thrust unwillingly into the center of dramatic events. "The walking stick troubles me most," he confided to anyone who would listen. "It was lying quite 6 feet from where he fell, and at such an odd angle. If a man stumbles in fog, surely his stick would fall closer to hand." This observation, repeated throughout the morning, had begun to take on the weight of evidence in the minds of those eager to find mystery, where Inspector Slack saw only misfortune. Miss Marple encountered Dr. Haydock near the scene itself, where he appeared to be conducting a more thorough examination than his initial assessment had allowed. The good doctor's professional skepticism had clearly been aroused by something he had observed but not yet articulated. "Curious thing, Miss Marple," he said, glancing around to ensure their privacy. "I've been thinking about the nature of Mr. Fortescue's injuries. The head wound is severe, yes, but remarkably localized for a man who supposedly stumbled blindly through fog. And his hands, they're quite unmarked. No defensive wounds, no scrapes from trying to break his fall. Most peculiar for someone who lost his footing on an unfamiliar path." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes taking in the scene with renewed attention. The stone wall showed no obvious signs of fresh damage, and the path itself was well maintained, with no apparent hazards that might cause even a fog-blinded walker to stumble. More interesting still were the faint impressions in the soft earth near the wall. 2 distinct sets of footprints, one showing the crisp outline of an expensive shoe, the other broader and deeper, as if made by someone carrying additional weight. Their quiet conference was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Caldwell, who appeared to be returning from the direction of the King's Head. The secretary had recovered some of her composure since the morning shock, but Miss Marple detected a nervous energy in her movements that suggested considerable internal turmoil. When Dr. Haydock inquired politely about her well-being, Miss Caldwell's response came perhaps a shade too quickly. "I've been making arrangements for Mr. Fortescue's effects," she explained, though her eyes kept drifting toward the spot where her employer had been found. "Such a terrible accident. He was always so methodical, so careful in everything he did. It seems impossible that he would simply lose his way." Miss Marple found herself studying the young woman's face as she spoke, noting the slight tension around her eyes and the way her hands remained clasped tightly together. There was something in Miss Caldwell's manner that suggested she was working very hard to maintain her composure, as if any relaxation of her guard might reveal something she preferred to keep hidden. As the day progressed, the village began to divide into camps. Inspector Slack's accident theory found support among those who preferred simple explanations to complicated mysteries. But a growing number of residents, influenced by Mrs. Eastham's whispered suspicions and the accumulating details that seemed to contradict the official verdict, began to entertain darker possibilities. Miss Marple walked home through streets that hummed with subdued excitement, her mind already beginning to sort through the various threads of information and observation. The fog had lifted from Little Wickham's lanes, but she suspected that the real obscurity surrounding Mr. Fortescue's death was only beginning to thicken. Human nature, she knew from long experience, was far more treacherous terrain than any fog-shrouded path, and the truth had a way of revealing itself through the smallest inconsistencies in behavior and circumstance. The pale December light seemed reluctant to fully commit itself to the day, casting Little Wickham in the sort of uncertain illumination that made shadows appear longer and secrets seem closer to the surface. Inspector Slack had established himself in the King's Head's small private sitting room, transforming the cozy space into an impromptu headquarters where he could conduct his interviews with the methodical efficiency that had earned him recognition at the county level. His fountain pen scratched across the pages of his notebook with the determined rhythm of a man confident in his ability to reduce human complexity to manageable facts. Miss Marple, having arrived with a jar of her celebrated quince preserves for Mrs. Hobbs, found herself positioned on a straight-backed chair in the adjoining passage, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a winter scarf. The proprietress had murmured something about Miss Marple's age and good sense, allowing her to remain within earshot of the proceedings. Miss Marple had no intention of deliberately eavesdropping, though she was perfectly willing to listen when people chose to speak loudly enough to be overheard. The first significant development came when young Timothy Fletcher arrived with a telegram that had been delivered to the post office the previous evening. The boy's face was flushed with the importance of his errand as he handed Inspector Slack a flimsy yellow slip of paper. The message, addressed to Mr. Fortescue at the King's Head and intended for delivery to the parish hall, was brief but startling. Back gate of inn, 9:45, urgent. H. Inspector Slack studied the telegram with the satisfaction of a man who had just been handed the missing piece of his puzzle. The timing aligned perfectly with the period after Mr. Fortescue had left the tea gathering, and the location matched exactly where the body had been discovered. The initial H provided a tantalizing clue that immediately focused his attention on the village's most obvious candidate. Harold Nash, the local builder whose voice had been the loudest in recent debates about the proposed development of the village common, quickly emerged as the primary suspect. Nash had been vocal in his criticism of what he termed outside interference in local affairs, and several witnesses recalled heated exchanges between him and Mr. Fortescue regarding construction contracts and planning permissions. When Inspector Slack dispatched Sergeant Williams to bring Nash in for questioning, the man came willingly, his manner displaying the sort of expansive bonhomie that Miss Marple had learned to regard with particular interest. Nash presented himself as a picture of injured innocence, his thick-set frame radiating the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding committees and charming his way through difficulties. His explanation for the telegram was delivered with a laugh that carried perhaps a shade too much volume. "Could be half the county with that initial," he declared, settling himself comfortably in the chair across from Inspector Slack. "If the gentleman wanted to see me, he could have telephoned. I was home all evening with my wife, listening to the wireless program. You can ask Marion yourself." Mrs. Nash, when summoned, provided the expected corroboration with a promptness that Miss Marple found noteworthy. The woman's agreement came without hesitation, delivered with a sort of practiced efficiency that suggested a conversation rehearsed rather than remembered. Miss Marple observed the slight tension around Mrs. Nash's eyes and the way her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap, as if she were holding something carefully in place. Dr. Haydock's arrival added another layer of complexity to the investigation. The physician's earlier confidence in the accidental death theory had clearly been shaken by his more thorough examination of the scene. When Inspector Slack questioned him about the nature of Mr. Fortescue's injuries, Dr. Haydock's response was measured but troubling. "The head wound is remarkably localized," he explained, consulting his notes with professional precision. "The angle suggests an impact from above rather than below, which would be inconsistent with a fall against the stone wall. Moreover, I discovered what appears to be blood traces on a heavy oak branch found some distance from the body, as if it had been moved after the incident." Inspector Slack received this information with visible reluctance, his pen hovering over his notebook as if the words resisted being written. The medical evidence complicated his preferred narrative of accidental death, but the telegram and Nash's obvious motive provided an alternative explanation that satisfied his need for a swift resolution. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting details that others overlooked. Nash's boots bore traces of dried lime wash rather than the mud one might expect from a nighttime walk through fog-shrouded lanes. The deeper, broader footprints near the scene suggested someone carrying additional weight or leaning forward repeatedly, as if engaged in some form of physical effort beyond simple walking. As the afternoon progressed, the village began to divide into factions. Those who favored simple explanations supported Inspector Slack's evolving theory that Nash had lured Mr. Fortescue to a clandestine meeting and killed him during a confrontation about the construction contracts. Others, influenced by Mrs. Eastham's whispered concerns about the parish accounts and Mrs. Armitage's nervous behavior, suggested that the church treasurer's financial irregularities provided an equally compelling motive. Miss Marple walked home through streets that hummed with subdued excitement, her mind carefully cataloguing the various threads of evidence and observation. The telegram provided concrete proof that Mr. Fortescue's death had been no accident, but the identity of H remained tantalizingly elusive. Human nature, she knew from decades of careful study, was far more complex than any official investigation typically acknowledged, and the truth had a way of revealing itself through the smallest inconsistencies in behavior and circumstance. The fog had lifted from Little Wickham's physical landscape, but Miss Marple suspected that the real obscurity surrounding Mr. Fortescue's death was only beginning to thicken, and that the obvious suspect so eagerly embraced by Inspector Slack might prove to be merely the first layer of a far more intricate deception. The afternoon shadows lengthened across Little Wickham as Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that seemed to contradict Inspector Slack's confident progress toward charging Harold Nash. While the official investigation gathered momentum around the builder's obvious motive and the convenient telegram, she had begun to notice smaller inconsistencies that whispered of a more complex truth beneath the surface of village gossip and official certainty. Her most significant observation concerned Mr. Fortescue's walking stick, a detail that had nagged at her consciousness since the morning's discovery, but had only now crystallized into something approaching understanding. She remembered the Member of Parliament at the previous evening's tea, a man of meticulous personal habits who had taken obvious pride in his appearance. At one point during the gathering, she had noticed him carefully buffing the silver head of his walking stick with a corner of his handkerchief, a small gesture that spoke of vanity and attention to detail. When she had first glimpsed the walking stick beside Mr. Fortescue's body, something had struck her as wrong, though she had been unable to articulate the source of her unease at the time. Now, reconstructing the scene in her mind with the careful precision she applied to her most complex knitting patterns, she realized what had troubled her. The silver head, which Mr. Fortescue had so carefully polished the evening before, had been dull and tarnished, bearing a dark smear, as if it had been dragged through something gritty or oily. This observation, seemingly trivial in isolation, took on greater significance when considered alongside Dr. Haydick's medical findings. A man who had simply stumbled and fallen in the fog would not have his walking stick end up several feet away bearing such distinctive marks. The tarnished condition suggested the stick had been handled roughly, perhaps even used for purposes other than mere support, and certainly moved or manipulated after being discarded. Miss Marple's contemplation of this puzzle led her to seek additional information about the evening's events, and her steps turned naturally toward the cottage of Mrs. Armitage, whose nervous behavior during her conversation with Mr. Fortescue had lingered in Miss Marple's memory. The church treasurer received her unexpected visitor with a sort of flustered hospitality that immediately confirmed something was weighing heavily on the woman's mind. Mrs. Armitage's cottage told its own story to Miss Marple's observant eye. The sitting room, while immaculate, showed signs of recent intensive activity around a small writing desk near the window. Fresh ink stains marked the blotter, and several sheets of calculations lay scattered in the wastepaper basket. More tellingly, the desk drawer bore new scratches around its lock, suggesting it had been opened repeatedly with considerable urgency. During their conversation over tea, Mrs. Armitage's distress became increasingly apparent as she spoke about Mr. Fortescue's interest in the parish finances. Her hands trembled slightly as she explained how her nephew had borrowed a small sum from the Restoration Fund to purchase a motorcycle, with every intention of replacing the money immediately. When Mr. Fortescue had begun asking detailed questions about the accounts, she had promised to bring the ledgers to him at the King's Head the following morning for a private review. Miss Marple noted this detail with particular interest, as it suggested Mr. Fortescue had arranged multiple meetings for the period following the tea gathering. The telegram summoning him to the back gate represented only one strand of his evening's activities, and the complexity of his schedule raised questions about which appointment had ultimately proved fatal. As she prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple made a casual inquiry about whether anyone in the village might be missing a fountain pen, describing an expensive item with gold nib and engraved initials. Mrs. Armitage's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Her teacup rattled against its saucer, and her face went quite pale before she managed to suggest it might belong to Mr. Fortescue himself. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence that suggested Inspector Slack's neat theory might be premature. The walking stick's condition spoke of violence and deliberate manipulation, while Mrs. Armitage's obvious distress indicated knowledge she had not yet shared with the official investigation. The fountain pen, if it indeed belonged to Mr. Fortescue, raised questions about where and why he had lost it during his final evening. Human nature, Miss Marple knew from decades of careful observation, rarely arranged itself as tidily as official investigations preferred. The obvious suspect, like the first impression in any social situation, often proved to be merely the most convenient explanation, rather than the most accurate one. As the village settled into evening routine, she suspected that the real truth about Mr. Fortescue's death lay hidden beneath layers of respectability and careful deception that would require far more delicate excavation than Inspector Slack's straightforward approach could provide. The next morning brought with it the peculiar clarity that often follows a night of troubled sleep, and Miss Marple found herself possessed of that particular restlessness which, in her long experience, usually indicated that important details were arranging themselves just beyond the reach of conscious understanding. The village had settled into the second day after Mr. Fortescue's death, with the sort of nervous energy that accompanies unresolved mysteries, and she decided that a few carefully chosen inquiries might help illuminate the shadows that Inspector Slack's confident progress seemed determined to ignore. Her first destination was the post office, where young Mr. Finch received her with the eager helpfulness of someone who had found himself unexpectedly central to dramatic events. When Miss Marple expressed mild curiosity about the telegram that had summoned Mr. Fortescue to his fate, Mr. Finch was delighted to consult his records and share the details that had escaped the inspector's more cursory examination. The telegram, it transpired, had been telephoned rather than delivered in person, a detail that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Mr. Finch recalled the call with remarkable precision, noting that it had come through at exactly 9:10 from the public telephone box near the Lich Gate. The voice had been distinctly feminine, he explained, though not one he recognized as belonging to any local resident. More intriguingly, when he had later gone to service the telephone box, he had discovered that the coin mechanism had been jammed with a bent hairpin, and the small space had retained the lingering scent of an expensive perfume. These details painted a picture of careful premeditation that sat uneasily with Inspector Slack's theory of a spontaneous confrontation between Mr. Fortescue and Harold Nash. A woman had made that call, using a public telephone to maintain anonymity, and had taken care to disguise her identity while luring the Member of Parliament to what would prove to be his final appointment. The bent hairpin suggested someone familiar with the mechanical workings of such devices, while the expensive perfume hinted at a person of some social standing rather than a casual opportunist. Miss Marple's contemplation of these facts led her to observe the village's daily rhythms with renewed attention, and she soon noticed subtle tensions that had escaped her earlier notice. At the baker's shop, she witnessed a brief but telling encounter between Mrs. Nash and Miss Caldwell, the deceased politician's secretary. The two women exchanged polite greetings, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of hostility in Mrs. Nash's manner that spoke of grievances extending well beyond the previous evening's tragedy. The older woman's eyes followed Miss Caldwell with the sort of watchful resentment that Miss Marple recognized from years of observing village social dynamics. It was the look of someone who felt that another person possessed something that rightfully belonged to them, or who harbored suspicions about relationships that others assumed to be purely professional. When Miss Caldwell departed, Mrs. Nash's expression carried a satisfaction that seemed inappropriate for someone whose husband remained under suspicion for murder. This observation prompted Miss Marple to recall fragments of village gossip that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on new meaning. During the summer fete, several residents had commented on Mr. Fortescue's particularly attentive behavior toward his secretary, noting how he had remained by her side throughout the afternoon and had seemed unusually solicitous of her comfort. At the time, such observations had been dismissed as the natural courtesy of an employer toward a valued employee, but Mrs. Nash's obvious animosity suggested that others had interpreted the relationship quite differently. The possibility of romantic entanglement added an entirely new dimension to the case, one that Inspector Slack's focus on construction contracts and local politics had completely overlooked. If Mr. Fortescue and Miss Caldwell had indeed been conducting an affair, it would explain the secretary's nervous behavior and provide a motive for someone who felt betrayed or threatened by such a relationship. More significantly, it would account for the feminine voice that had lured Mr. Fortescue to his death, as well as the intimate knowledge of his movements that the killer had demonstrated. Miss Marple's investigation took a more concrete turn when she encountered Dr. Haydock near the scene of the crime, where he was conducting what appeared to be a final examination of the physical evidence. The physician's expression carried the weight of additional discoveries that had clearly troubled him since his initial assessment of the case. Dr. Haydock confided that his more thorough analysis had revealed several disturbing inconsistencies with the official theory of accidental death. The head wound, while severe, showed characteristics that suggested a deliberate blow rather than the result of a fall against the stone wall. More troubling still, he had discovered traces of a sedative substance on Mr. Fortescue's clothing, indicating that the victim had been rendered unconscious before being killed. This finding transformed the crime from a spontaneous confrontation into a carefully planned murder that required both medical knowledge and considerable forethought. The presence of sedative traces also explained several puzzling aspects of the crime scene that had nagged at Miss Marple's consciousness. Mr. Fortescue's lack of defensive wounds, the precise positioning of his body, and the absence of any signs of struggle all made sense if he had been incapacitated before the fatal blow was struck. The killer had not relied on strength or surprise, but had used pharmaceutical means to ensure their victim's helplessness, suggesting someone with access to medical supplies and the knowledge to use them effectively. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself reconstructing the events of that foggy evening with growing clarity. The feminine voice that had telephoned the telegram, the careful timing that had allowed the caller to position herself near the lich gate, and the use of sedatives all pointed toward a killer who had planned every detail of the crime with methodical precision. The fog had provided perfect cover for what was essentially an execution disguised as a village tragedy, and the obvious suspect of Harold Nash had served as a convenient distraction from the real perpetrator. The missing elements of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern that revealed not just the method of Mr. Fortescue's murder, but the complex web of personal relationships and hidden grievances that had made such a crime both possible and, in the killer's mind, necessary. Miss Marple suspected that the final revelation would prove to involve not the obvious motives of political disagreement or financial irregularity, but the far more dangerous territory of betrayed trust and wounded pride that lay at the heart of so many village tragedies. The implications of Dr. Haydock's sedative findings rippled through the investigation like stones cast into still water, each revelation creating new circles of possibility that Inspector Slack seemed determined to ignore in favor of his increasingly elaborate theory involving Harold Nash. Miss Marple observed the inspector's stubborn adherence to his original suspect with the sort of patient interest she reserved for particularly challenging knitting patterns, noting how human nature possessed an unfortunate tendency to reshape evidence to fit preconceived notions rather than allowing facts to guide understanding. The evening brought an unexpected development that would have delighted Inspector Slack had he been present to witness it. Mrs. Hobbs, making her final rounds at the King's Head, noticed a thin sliver of light beneath the door of Mr. Fortescue's sealed room. Her immediate alarm brought Sergeant Williams hurrying from his post near the village green, and together they discovered Miss Caldwell inside the deceased politician's quarters, her pale face illuminated by a small electric torch as she searched through the contents of his writing desk. The secretary's explanation came in breathless, nervous bursts that spoke of genuine distress rather than calculated deception. She had received a note, she insisted, written in Mr. Fortescue's distinctive hand, and delivered to her cottage that very afternoon, instructing her to collect his private correspondence before the official investigation could examine it. The note itself, when produced from her handbag, bore all the hallmarks of authentic urgency, though something in its phrasing struck Miss Marple as oddly impersonal for a communication between employer and trusted secretary. More damaging than the note, however, were the physical items discovered in Miss Caldwell's possession. A small blue vial, labeled as chloral hydrate, nestled among her personal effects, its contents sufficient to render a grown man unconscious within minutes of administration. Her explanation that she suffered from nervous complaints and required the sedative for sleep seemed plausible enough, yet the timing of its discovery cast an unfortunate shadow over her presence in the dead man's room. The key she had used to access Mr. Fortescue's dispatch box provided another troubling element to the scene. Mrs. Hobbs, when consulted, revealed that the politician had been particular about security, keeping his personal key on a watch chain and having recently had the lock mechanism repaired. The key in Miss Caldwell's possession was clearly the older version, one that should have been discarded but had somehow found its way into her custody, raising questions about how long she had possessed unauthorized access to her employer's private papers. Miss Marple positioned herself near the window during the questioning, her presence so unobtrusive that the participants seemed to forget her entirely. From this vantage point, she observed not only the evidence being catalogued, but the subtle reactions of those involved. Miss Caldwell's surprise at certain contents of the dispatch box suggested she had expected to find something that was conspicuously absent, while her occasional glances toward other areas of the room indicated a search that had not achieved its intended purpose. The discovery of faint traces of lime wash on the window sill provided yet another connection to Harold Nash, whose boots had borne similar markings throughout the investigation. Inspector Slack, arriving with the satisfaction of a man whose theories were being systematically confirmed, saw this as additional evidence of the builder's guilt, though Miss Marple noted that limewash was hardly an uncommon substance in a village where several construction projects were currently underway. As the official examination continued, word arrived that added another layer of complexity to the evening's revelations. Mrs. Armitage appeared at the inn in a state of considerable distress, reporting that the church ledgers had vanished from her locked desk drawer. The books that Mr. Fortescue had intended to examine were gone, their disappearance suggesting that someone feared what a thorough audit might reveal about the parish finances. This development sent fresh waves of speculation through the assembled crowd. The missing ledgers provided an entirely new motive for murder, one that shifted attention from personal grievances to financial irregularities. Mrs. Armitage's obvious distress seemed to confirm that the books contained information worth killing to conceal, though Miss Marple noted that the woman's anxiety might equally stem from fear of being suspected rather than guilt over actual wrongdoing. Miss Marple walked home through streets that hummed with renewed excitement, her mind carefully sorting through the evening's accumulation of evidence and revelation. The discovery of Miss Caldwell in Mr. Fortescue's room, while dramatic, raised more questions than it answered. The chloral vial and unauthorized key certainly suggested capability and opportunity, yet something in the secretary's genuine surprise at certain aspects of her search indicated that she, like Harold Nash, might be serving as a convenient scapegoat for someone far more cunning. The missing ledgers struck her as particularly significant, not for what they might contain, but for the timing of their disappearance. Someone was actively manipulating the investigation, creating false trails and reinforcing suspicions with a sophistication that spoke of careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. The real killer, she suspected, was not merely reacting to events but orchestrating them with the skill of a master puppeteer, using the village's own assumptions and prejudices to direct attention away from the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The morning after Miss Caldwell's discovery brought news that sent fresh ripples of unease through Little Wickham's carefully maintained composure. Dr. Haydock arrived at the King's Head with his professional demeanor strained by the discovery that his surgery had been burglarized during the night. Someone had forced the back window with considerable skill, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence and a conspicuous gap on the shelf where he kept his sedatives and controlled substances. The theft was remarkably selective, Dr. Haydock explained to Inspector Slack with barely concealed frustration. A bottle of veronal had been taken, along with several other compounds that could render a person unconscious if administered properly. More significantly, the footprints in the soft earth beneath the window showed the distinctive pattern of small, neat shoes with low heels, suggesting a female intruder who had moved with purpose and confidence through the doctor's private domain. Inspector Slack received this information with the weary resignation of a man whose neat theories were being systematically complicated by inconvenient facts. The theft provided yet another layer of premeditation to what he had hoped to resolve as a straightforward case of village rivalry and feminine footprints seemed to support his growing suspicion that Miss Caldwell had been more deeply involved in the crime than her nervous protestations suggested. The morning's revelations took a more dramatic turn when Mrs. Nash, making her customary rounds with fresh eggs and village gossip, discovered Mrs. Armitage unconscious in her cottage sitting room. The church treasurer lay crumpled before her hearth, the window thrown open to the winter air and an overturned teacup beside her pale hand. A folded letter on the mantelpiece declared in tremulous script her guilt for the misappropriation of parish funds and responsibility for a terrible accident in the fog, while the missing ledgers sat neatly arranged beneath a crocheted antimacassar. Miss Marple arrived at the scene with her customary quiet efficiency, positioning herself where she could observe both the physical evidence and the reactions of those present. Something about the tableau struck her as oddly theatrical, as if arranged by someone with a keen understanding of what would satisfy official expectations while deflecting deeper scrutiny. The confession letter, though written in Mrs. Armitage's hand, employed phrases and terminology that seemed foreign to the woman's naturally circumspect manner of expression. More tellingly, the paper bore the watermark of the king's head, an unlikely choice for someone writing a private confession in her own home. The fountain pen placed conspicuously beside the ledgers carried Mr. Fortescue's engraved initials, its gold nib bearing traces of the quick-drying ink that had become popular at the post office, but leaving no corresponding stains on Mrs. Armitage's fingers. The entire scene possessed the careful composition of a stage set, designed to convince observers while concealing the true hand behind its arrangement. Dr. Haydock's examination confirmed that Mrs. Armitage had indeed been drugged, though not fatally. The dosage suggested someone with medical knowledge who had calculated precisely the amount needed to incapacitate without killing, a level of sophistication that spoke of careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. When the treasurer recovered sufficiently to speak, she insisted with bewildered certainty that she would never have used the word misappropriation in any document, preferring the gentler redeployment that ecclesiastical protocol demanded. As the official investigation absorbed these new developments, Miss Marple found herself drawn to subtle details that others overlooked. A faint but distinctive perfume lingered in Mrs. Armitage's cottage, the same expensive scent that young Mr. Finch had detected in the telephone box by the lich gate. The fragrance spoke of someone accustomed to luxury, someone who moved through the village's social circles with confidence and familiarity. Her afternoon brought an opportunity to test her growing suspicions when she encountered Mrs. Nash near the post office. The builder's wife received Miss Marple's gentle inquiries with increasing agitation, her usual composure cracking under the pressure of seemingly innocent questions about the night of Mr. Fortescue's death. When Miss Marple mentioned the bent hairpin found in the telephone box and the distinctive rose perfume that had lingered there, Mrs. Nash's denial came too quickly, too emphatically, even as the same costly fragrance seemed to emanate from her very presence. The woman's defensive reactions to questions about the missing ledgers and her casual dismissal of creative accounting revealed knowledge that extended beyond mere village gossip. Her animosity toward Miss Caldwell, initially attributed to moral disapproval, now appeared to stem from deeper fears about exposure and the protection of carefully guarded secrets. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked home through streets that hummed with fresh speculation, her mind weaving together the threads of evidence that pointed toward a truth far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward theories could accommodate. The real killer, she suspected, was someone who had used the village's own assumptions and prejudices as camouflage, orchestrating a deception that transformed personal desperation into an elaborate performance designed to satisfy official expectations while concealing the true motives that had driven them to murder in the fog-shrouded darkness of a December night. The morning brought with it the crystalline clarity that often follows a night of troubled contemplation, and Miss Marple found herself possessed of that particular determination which, in her long experience, usually indicated that the time for gentle observation had passed and the moment for more direct action had arrived. The accumulation of evidence pointing toward Mrs. Nash had reached the threshold where theory must be tested against reality, and she knew that only a carefully orchestrated psychological examination would reveal whether her suspicions were justified or merely the product of an overactive imagination. Her opportunity came when she encountered Mrs. Nash returning from the baker's shop, her usual confident stride somewhat diminished by the weight of recent events. Miss Marple approached with her characteristic diffidence, suggesting that perhaps they might share a cup of tea and discuss the terrible upheaval that had befallen their peaceful village. Mrs. Nash's acceptance carried the brittle quality of someone who dared not refuse such an innocent invitation, though her eyes held a wariness that spoke of deeper concerns than mere social obligation. The Nash cottage, while maintaining its usual appearance of prosperous respectability, showed subtle signs of strain that Miss Marple's trained eye immediately detected. A fine tremor in Mrs. Nash's hands as she prepared the tea service, the way her gaze kept drifting toward the window as if expecting unwelcome visitors, and most tellingly, the lingering presence of that expensive rose perfume, which seemed to intensify whenever its wearer grew agitated, as if emotional distress somehow amplified the fragrance. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably in the offered chair, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm as she worked on a simple pattern that required little attention. This allowed her to focus entirely on her hostess while maintaining the appearance of harmless domestic activity. She began her gentle interrogation with seemingly innocent observations about the night of Mr. Fortescue's death, expressing wonder at how anyone had managed to navigate the treacherous fog with such apparent confidence. The conversation took a more pointed turn when Miss Marple mentioned the telephone call that had lured Mr. Fortescue to his fatal appointment, wondering aloud about the courage required for someone to venture out alone in such weather. Mrs. Nash's agreement came with a note of pride that she quickly attempted to suppress, but not before Miss Marple had caught the telltale flash of satisfaction that crossed her features. It was the reaction of someone who had successfully completed a difficult task under challenging circumstances. Miss Marple's most significant test came when she casually produced the bent hairpin that young Mr. Finch had discovered in the telephone box, describing it as a remarkably ingenious solution to the problem of jamming the coin mechanism. She spoke admiringly of the technical knowledge such an approach would require, noting how it demonstrated familiarity with mechanical devices that most village residents would not possess. Mrs. Nash's defensive reaction was immediate and revealing, her denial accompanied by an elaborate explanation of her husband's construction work that demonstrated precisely the kind of expertise the crime had required. The psychological pressure began to tell as Miss Marple continued her gentle probing, each seemingly innocent question designed to test Mrs. Nash's knowledge of details that only the killer could have known. When she mentioned the sedative stolen from Dr. Haydock's surgery, Mrs. Nash's response betrayed an understanding of proper dosages that went well beyond casual familiarity. Her dismissal of their significance was too detailed, too precise, revealing the kind of medical knowledge that the crime had clearly required. The conversation reached its crucial turning point when Miss Marple spoke of the tragic irony surrounding Mr. Fortescue's death, noting how it had occurred just as he was beginning to investigate irregularities in local business practices. Mrs. Nash's composure finally cracked, her carefully maintained facade dissolving into the desperate fury that had driven her to murder. The words tumbled out in a torrent of justification and self-pity, revealing how she had killed to protect her husband's reputation from what she characterized as Fortescue's blackmail attempts. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession, and Miss Marple observed with professional detachment the exact moment when Mrs. Nash realized what she had revealed. The woman's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, and finally a kind of desperate defiance as she attempted to retract her words. But the damage was done, the critical reaction observed and catalogued with the same precision Miss Marple applied to her most complex knitting patterns. Mrs. Nash's breakdown was complete and devastating, her veneer of respectability stripped away to reveal the calculating mind that had orchestrated Mr. Fortescue's death with such methodical precision. She had used the fog as cover, her knowledge of village routines as camouflage, and the obvious suspects as convenient distractions from her own careful planning. The real tragedy, Miss Marple reflected as she quietly signaled for Sergeant Williams, lay not in the violence itself, but in how ordinary human emotions had been corrupted into something capable of such calculated destruction. As the arrest proceeded with quiet efficiency, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a particularly challenging pattern. The psychological test had revealed exactly what she had suspected: confirming that beneath Little Wickham's peaceful exterior lay the same capacity for deception and violence that she had encountered so many times before in her long study of human nature. The formal gathering in the King's Head's private sitting room that evening carried the weight of a tribunal, though Miss Marple's presence at the small table by the window suggested something far more gentle than official justice. Inspector Slack occupied the chair nearest the fireplace, with the defensive posture of a man whose theories had been systematically dismantled, while Dr. Haydock stood beside the mantelpiece, his medical bag at hand and his expression troubled by the afternoon's revelations. Miss Caldwell sat rigidly upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Mrs. Armitage, still pale from her ordeal, occupied a chair near the door as if ready to flee at the first sign of additional distress. Harold Nash hovered uncertainly near his wife, his ruddy face bearing the bewildered expression of a man who had discovered that his life's companion was capable of calculations he could never have imagined. Mrs. Nash herself sat with the brittle composure of someone whose carefully constructed facade had finally cracked beyond repair, though she maintained the erect posture that had served her so well throughout years of village social leadership. Miss Marple arranged her knitting with the methodical precision she applied to all complex patterns, her pale blue eyes taking in each face with the sort of gentle attention that had proven so devastating to carefully guarded secrets. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades observing the infinite variations of human nature and found them all remarkably predictable. "The fog that descended upon our village 3 nights ago," she began, her needles clicking softly as she worked, "provided the perfect cover for a crime that had been planned with remarkable attention to detail. Mr. Fortescue did not die by accident, as Inspector Slack initially supposed, nor was he killed in a moment of passionate anger, as the evidence seemed to suggest. He was murdered by someone who understood both his habits and his weaknesses, someone who used our village's own assumptions and prejudices as camouflage for a carefully orchestrated deception." She paused to examine her stitching with the same careful attention she had applied to examining the crime scene, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. The telegram that summoned Mr. Fortescue to his death was indeed sent by someone using the initial H, but young Mr. Finch's sharp ears detected what Inspector Slack's investigation overlooked. The call was made by a woman. The bent hairpin found in the telephone box's coin mechanism was not the random vandalism it appeared to be, but a deliberate tool used by someone familiar with such mechanical devices. Most tellingly, the expensive rose perfume that lingered in that confined space belonged to someone accustomed to luxury, someone who moved through our village's social circles with confidence and familiarity. Mrs. Nash's hands tightened imperceptibly in her lap, though her expression remained carefully neutral, as Miss Marple continued her gentle but inexorable reconstruction of the crime. Mr. Fortescue's walking stick provided the most significant clue to the true nature of his death, Miss Marple observed, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a particularly intricate stitch pattern. "I remembered how carefully he had polished its silver head during the tea gathering, yet when discovered beside his body, it was tarnished and bore dark smears that suggested rough handling. The stick had not simply fallen from his grasp during an accidental tumble. It had been used as a weapon, wielded with desperate strength by someone who needed to ensure his permanent silence." Dr. Haydock's expression grew increasingly grave as Miss Marple's explanation confirmed his own medical observations, while Inspector Slack's pen remained motionless above his notebook as if the words resisted being written into official record. The sedatives stolen from Dr. Haydock's surgery were obtained through a carefully planned burglary that required intimate knowledge of the physician's routines and considerable skill with mechanical locks. The footprints beneath the surgery window showed the distinctive pattern of small, neat shoes with low heels. Not the heavy boots one might expect from a casual thief, but the careful steps of someone who had studied the approach for weeks before acting. Miss Marple's needles paused as she looked directly at Mrs. Nash, her pale eyes holding a mixture of sadness and professional interest. The actual murder was accomplished with the methodical precision that characterized every aspect of this crime. Mrs. Nash waited in the fog near the King's Head's back gate, offering Mr. Fortescue what appeared to be a social drink to ward off the cold. The chloral hydrate dissolved in the brandy rendered him unconscious within minutes, allowing her to strike the fatal blow with his own walking stick before arranging the scene to suggest accidental death. The room held its breath as Miss Marple continued, her voice never rising above its gentle conversational tone despite the horrific nature of what she was describing. What followed was perhaps even more calculated than the murder itself. A systematic campaign to create false trails that would lead the investigation away from the true perpetrator. The forged confession letter placed beside Mrs. Armitage after she had been drugged bore the watermark of King's Head stationery and was written with Mr. Fortescue's own fountain pen, details chosen to convince official investigators while concealing the real author's identity. Mrs. Armitage pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her face growing pale as she realized how completely she had been manipulated, while Miss Caldwell's eyes widened with understanding of her own narrow escape from a similar fate. Miss Caldwell's discovery in Mr. Fortescue's room was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to implicate an innocent woman. The note that lured her there bore Mr. Fortescue's handwriting, but employed phrases and terminology foreign to his natural manner of expression. The chloral vial found in her possession and the unauthorized key were planted evidence, chosen because Mrs. Nash knew of the secretary's legitimate need for sedatives and her access to the politician's private papers. Harold Nash's voice emerged as a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the crackling of the fireplace. "Marian, tell me this isn't true." His wife's response came with the flat precision of someone reciting a lesson learned too well. "Everything she says is accurate, Harold. I killed Mr. Fortescue because he was going to destroy everything we had built together. His investigation into the parish contracts would have exposed your creative accounting, and I could not allow our reputation to be ruined by an outsider who understood nothing about how village business is properly conducted." The confession that followed poured from Mrs. Nash with the relief of someone finally abandoning a performance that had become too exhausting to maintain. She described the weeks of planning, the careful study of village routines, the acquisition of sedatives, and the technical knowledge needed to use them effectively. Most chilling of all was her detailed account of the psychological manipulation she had employed to direct suspicion toward innocent parties, using their own fears and vulnerabilities as weapons in her campaign of misdirection. Inspector Slack listened to this recitation with the stunned attention of a man whose professional competence had been thoroughly demonstrated to be inadequate to the complexities of human nature. His neat theories about construction disputes and political rivalries seemed almost quaint compared to the psychological labyrinth that Mrs. Nash had constructed around her crime. As the formal charges were read, and Mrs. Nash was led away with quiet dignity, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste that such calculated evil represented. The woman's intelligence and determination, properly directed, might have achieved remarkable things, but her inability to accept responsibility for her husband's failings had transformed legitimate concerns into murderous obsession. "Human nature," she observed quietly to Dr. Haydock as the room gradually emptied, "remains remarkably consistent across all social circumstances. The fog may have lifted from our village streets, but I suspect it will be some time before Little Wickham fully recovers from the knowledge that such careful deception could flourish beneath the surface of daily respectability. Still, truth has a way of revealing itself through the smallest inconsistencies if one knows how to look for them. The village would indeed recover, as villages always did, but the events of those fog-shrouded December days would linger in memory as a reminder that beneath the most peaceful exterior could lie depths of calculation and violence that challenged every assumption about the nature of rural tranquility. The formal proceedings that followed Mrs. Nash's confession unfolded with the quiet efficiency that characterized all official business in Little Wickham, though the weight of revelation hung over the king's head like a pall that no amount of winter sunlight could entirely dispel. Inspector Slack remained in the village for 3 additional days, his initial confidence replaced by the sort of professional humility that comes from having one's methods thoroughly exposed as inadequate to the complexities of human psychology. When he finally sought out Miss Marple for a private conversation, it was with the reluctant acknowledgement that her gentle observations had succeeded where his more direct approach had failed. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room with the same quiet courtesy she extended to all visitors, though she noted with interest how the inspector's manner had softened from the brusque certainty that had characterized his early investigation. His questions, when they came, revealed a genuine desire to understand the subtle indicators that had guided her toward the truth while he had been systematically misled by Mrs. Nash's carefully planted evidence. "The walking stick troubled me from the beginning," Miss Marple explained, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm as she spoke. "Mr. Fortescue was particular about his appearance, and I remembered how carefully he had polished its silver head during the tea gathering. When I saw it beside his body, tarnished and bearing those dark smears, I knew it had been used for purposes other than mere support. The distance from the body suggested deliberate placement rather than an accidental fall, and the condition of the silver indicated rough handling by someone who cared nothing for its appearance." Inspector Slack's notebook filled steadily as Miss Marple continued her methodical explanation of the evidence he had overlooked. The bent hairpin in the telephone box had been no random act of vandalism, but a deliberate tool employed by someone familiar with mechanical devices. The expensive rose perfume that lingered in that confined space belonged to a woman accustomed to luxury, someone who moved through village social circles with confidence and familiarity. Mrs. Nash's greatest error, Miss Marple observed with gentle precision, lay in her assumption that creating obvious suspects would prevent anyone from examining her own actions too closely. The telegram, with its convenient initial H, was designed to implicate Harold Nash, while the planted evidence in Miss Caldwell's possession served to provide an alternative suspect should the first theory prove inadequate. She understood village psychology well enough to know that people would prefer simple explanations to complex ones, and she used that knowledge to construct a deception of remarkable sophistication. The revelation of Mrs. Nash's systematic manipulation of evidence had profound effects on all those who had been drawn into her web of deception. Miss Caldwell, cleared of all suspicion, departed Little Wickham within the week, her confidence in village life permanently shaken by the knowledge of how completely she had been used as a pawn in someone else's deadly game. Her farewell visit to Miss Marple carried the weight of genuine gratitude mixed with a profound unease about the depths of calculation that could exist beneath the surface of daily respectability. Mrs. Armitage recovered from her ordeal with the resilience that Miss Marple had observed in many victims of elaborate psychological manipulation, though the church treasurer's approach to her duties now carried a wariness that spoke of hard-won wisdom about the dangers of trusting appearances. The missing ledgers, returned to their proper place, revealed nothing more sinister than the sort of creative bookkeeping that characterized many village organizations operating on limited resources, though the treasurer's nephew faced appropriate consequences for his unauthorized borrowing. Harold Nash remained in Little Wickham, his construction business continuing under the shadow of his wife's crimes, but sustained by the community's recognition that he had been as much a victim of her deception as anyone else. His bewildered grief at discovering the true nature of the woman he had lived with for 30 years provided a poignant reminder of how completely one person could conceal their inner calculations from even their closest companions. Dr. Haydock's final assessment of the case focused on the medical precision with which Mrs. Nash had planned and executed her crime. The theft of sedatives from his surgery had required intimate knowledge of pharmaceutical effects and proper dosages, while the timing of Mr. Fortescue's incapacitation had been calculated with scientific accuracy. The physician's admiration for the technical aspects of the crime was tempered by horror at the cold-blooded nature of its execution. As the weeks passed, Little Wickham gradually returned to its customary rhythms, though the village bore the invisible scars of knowledge that such calculated evil could flourish beneath the surface of daily routine. The fog that had provided perfect cover for Mrs. Nash's crime had lifted permanently from the physical landscape, but Miss Marple suspected that the psychological obscurity surrounding the case would linger far longer in the collective memory of the community. Settling into her chair by the window as evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns of human behavior that had made the crime both possible and ultimately detectable. Truth, she knew from long experience, possessed an almost inevitable quality that made its eventual emergence both predictable and satisfying. No matter how elaborate the deception or how carefully constructed the false trails, the fundamental inconsistencies of human nature would ultimately reveal themselves to anyone patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand what they were seeing. The robin that visited her windowsill each evening appeared as the last light faded, regarding her with the same bright attention she had turned upon the village throughout the investigation. Little Wickham would heal from its recent trauma, as communities always did, but the lessons learned during those fog-shrouded December days would serve as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous mysteries often lay hidden beneath the most familiar faces, waiting for the right combination of observation and understanding to bring them into the revealing light of day.